Hi everyone, it's Kyle Cordes again. This is your, fourth episode or session of Angular Live Coding. I've decided to start titling this Angular Live Coding instead of Angular 2 Live Coding because Angular 3 really isn't that far away. It's not going to be a huge disruptive change like Angular 2 was, but almost everything we're doing here will be equally applicable to the next couple of versions of Angular at least. So Angular Live Coding it is, fourth session on streaming data. Again, I'm Kyle Cordes. I work at Oasis Digital, where we build complex things with Angular and other platforms, and I teach at Angular Bootcamp, where we teach companies and teams to do the same. I've started adding a new reminder. We are very often hiring, so if you're interested in doing this kind of work at a high level, please come take a look. Here is where we left off. We have a running program showing the most recent 5 quotes from our server, which provides fake made-up foreign exchange data using a server-side event channel. Over here, I still have the server running. You can look back at a previous video or look at a README to see how. Over here, I still have the CLI running with an ng-serve. Again, you can look in the documentation and see how. Here's where we are in terms of commits. So if you look up this commit in the history, you can see where we're starting today. And here is the GitHub location of the code that we're working with, if you want to bring this up and take a look yourself. Okay, so I think the next thing I'd like to do is solve this annoyance. This annoyance right here. Whenever we reload the page, we have to wait a while for the data to appear because we're buffering the data 5 rows at a time. We have to wait for 5 to appear, and that gets much worse if I filter this down to only see one of the feeds, or if I want to have a longer set of data. So I think I'd like to solve that, and it's pretty easy to solve that, and it gives us a great reason to talk about observables more. Okay, so at this point in the code where my cursor is, I have an observable stream of each new fake foreign exchange quote. And then with buffer count, I'm saying wait till I have 5 and then show me this sliding window of the most recent 5. I'd love to be able to say wait till we have 10, but I'm tired of waiting so long. What I'd like to do really is have my sequence start with, let's just maybe have it start with some placeholder data. So that way we can maybe always have a sliding window, and then we'll sort of have some placeholders. Now, ultimately, there's some problems with having placeholders in your observable stream, but they do give us a reason just to talk about some more observable features. And so I would say they're worthwhile for that reason alone, even if we take them out in a later session, which totally could happen. Okay, so there's an observable operator called starts with, or start with, and that lets you add some observables at the beginning of a stream. So I know I'm going to want that. So I happen to know it's called start with. Now, how did I know it's called start with? Well, that's mostly because I have spent an enormous amount of time studying the documentation. It's on this page, reactivex.io/rxjs. I believe this is not linked yet from the starting point, but this is where you find the documentation for RxJS version 5, which is still in beta. That's the version that works with Angular. So if you just start with the reactivex.io site, you'll find your way to the RxJS version 4 documentation, and 5 is different enough that you really want to make your way here and read this documentation. Now, I have read a lot of this documentation. In particular, I've read through and I've just learned many of the operators that come in the box for observables. So that's how I can just sort of type this stuff. It's because I've spent many hours learning about observables. Okay. So start with, so I have this operator start with. So at this point I have an observable stream, so I could say start with, and the thing you give start with is another observable. Oh, actually, it says I can give it an array. Let's try giving it an array. So let's just start with some empty objects. So I don't know if that's a great way to do it, but what if I just said, start this thing with some empty objects? Let's see if that works. It might work. That might be enough to give me the desired effect, or I might need to go deeper. Looks like it came up pretty soon. Or maybe we're not running it yet. You see how I said I want a buffer count of 10, but here in the window, oh, there we go. Okay, so if I reload it now, how quickly do I get data? Yeah, I'd say I'm still getting data. I don't know if you saw that go by, but one went by. And what happened is, if you pass this thing an array, you're not saying to start with each of these values. You're saying this whole array is a value. I think what I'm used to giving start with is another observable stream. So let's go ahead and find a way to do that. Okay, so if I add observable, and I happen to know that there is an observable operator, make sure I spell it here, range. Okay, so if I go in here, I could, let's just make a variable, so initial equals, we'll say it's an observable range, and 1 through 10. So this is going to be an observable sequence that just has the numbers 1 through 10. Not really good enough for what I need, but I can map that, and I can say for each value, instead give me an empty object. The problem is if I type it this way, the thing's going to be angry, right? Let's see here. I guess I don't have map. Let's get map. The meaning of this is a little bit irritating. This actually means a block of code, and a block of code implicitly returns an undefined, and I really don't want an undefined, but we'll let that appear on the screen before we deal with it. Okay, so here this should be an observable series of 10 hopefully empty objects, probably undefined, and I can simply say that my fx data, I want to kind of shim in these 10 empties before the real data starts, and that way when I run it through the buffer count, I should get something out of the buffer immediately. Let me see here. I keep having to look off to the side because when I press Alt-Tab or Command-Tab on my Mac, that's where my sequence appears. Okay, so if I do this again, let's see what happens. No, it still didn't work. Okay. It looked like I still had some single value floating up there. Okay, so maybe start with is not the right thing. Let's go take a look at the documentation. Like I said, this is live coding, and I tend to remember that there is an operator that does about what I want, but not always. Okay. Values. So what would you actually... iterable that contains the items you want. Well, that's interesting. So an array didn't work, but it needs to be something iterable. You know, that's probably not the easiest way to do this. Let's do this a different way instead that avoids this having to do this iterable thing here. There is a concat operator. The concat operator will do what I want. So operator, well, it's not an operator, it's part of observable. So observable has a thing available called concat, and so I could do a observable.concat, and the first thing I want to concat could be my initial sequence, and then the rest could be my sequence from the fx data, and then I need to close that paren like so. Okay, so I'm saying concatenate my initial, then that data. I'm not doing any kind of filtering, and then I want to buffer count the whole thing. So let's see if that yields something closer to what I was hoping for. And sure enough, it does. So that's exactly what I was hoping for. So the data appears immediately, but the first number of values might be empty while we're getting started. So again, I don't know if this is great. I don't know if this is the perfect way to do it, but we'll call this good enough. Now, before we check this in, though, I just want to stare at this. I think it might be, well, I need to consider whether this should be done in the fx data service. And I'm thinking no, because the fx data service really does just return the foreign exchange fake data. And I'm letting the visual component that consumes it decide to do this extra transformation in front of it. So I do think I'll make one more minor simplification. That thing didn't really need to have a variable name, so there we go. So I'm saying just concatenate 10 empty values in front of the rest of the data. Let's let it reload and make sure that we see that same effect of the data appearing, then marching up. So perfect, worked great. Now, as always, even here in live coding example code, I try to make many small commits. They could always be squashed down later. You can always do many small commits and then decide to aggregate that history. But if you don't capture the small commits, you can't make that decision later. So I'm going to go. I added a link to the README file. So for anybody following along in the repo, you'll get that link to the RX documentation. And then I have this change, which sort of lets us start with data already present. So let me see here. I think we'll name it only after the kind of the meaty change. I don't think I need to mention the README change here in the comment. So this is going to be start with placeholders, placeholder objects. So that's probably good enough, and I don't want to wait while we're recording, just in case every once in a while it takes a few minutes to get that push to work. Okay. What other improvements could be done here? Okay. Well, the next bit of frustration as I look at this code, and it kind of bothered me as I did this thing here, because I really don't know, did I just put an undefined in there, or is this an empty object? There's like a question of the exact meaning of this syntax. This is really pushing me toward another problem, and that problem is that this data is untyped. Like I feel bad about this any right here. So to get this typed, I'm going to ng, Angular CLI, generate an interface called fx quote. Let's assume, ooh, I thought interface was a thing. Maybe it's coming soon. Let's see. There we go. I guess you have to type out interface. So let's get this thing back up and running so I can live edit. Let's see. So it appeared. So I have this fx quote, and that's just an empty interface. But that's fine. Let's just start. Let's refer to it, right? So I can just go through my code, and anywhere I'm currently saying observable any, I want to say observable fx quote. And then, of course, to get fx quote, I need to, let me see here, fx quote, and it does not name those with the word interface. Following the CLI, following the style guide here. Okay, so that's a step, and then I believe my fx data service, it would be reasonable for it to return or to have the data typed as an fx quote. And then my SSE, this is generic SSE infrastructure, so I don't need to make any change there. And the module doesn't ever talk about the type, so it doesn't need to know about the interface. I'm curious here. This is kind of odd. Oh, so I guess the reason this isn't erroneous, the reason I don't have any errors around this type, is I haven't told the thing what's in the type yet. So let's do that. We're going to make this kind of quick and easy and hacky. I'm just going to copy a couple of these and then paste them in here and edit them up a little bit. So it looks like we have timestamp, which is a number, even though it probably is some sort of date inside. We have symbol is a string. And then for reasons I've forgotten, I think it was to make the number of decimal points explicit. I had chosen to have the bid and ask come through as strings. I thought about making those come through as numbers, but that would obscure the number of significant decimal places. So I think that is the actual type I want. Now I'm going to save everything and just see what kind of errors pop up. So in my data service, oddly enough, no errors there. How about in my component? So in my component, I'm getting a type error now. And it's saying this observable could be a void or an fx quote. So I think what happened is this concat said whatever came through these different sides, the type of the concatenated observable is the union of the type of the observables we pass through it. So what this is telling me is what I put in here, what I return here, has to be an fx quote. I could just say make it an fx quote, but I can't because fx quote is not a class. It is an interface. It's a description of data. So an important TypeScriptism here. What is the real meaning of an interface versus a class? And to me, the answer is that an interface is used to describe data or describe functionality without making any statement about where it came from. Whereas a class is really saying like, you use this constructor to make this thing. Here is the code for this type. Since this data is coming in from a back end, I think it makes sense to use an interface for this, not a class. I think using an interface expresses the meaning of this a little bit more closely. But it does leave me with this problem that I want to create something here, and I want it to be of that type. So this is actually a slightly irritating problem, but what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make one up and just make it look right. And this is going to be a little bit ugly. So the timestamp, we'll just make that be a 0, and then the symbol, we'll make that be a placeholder value of just a single dash, and then the bid and the ask will just be empty strings. So here I think, and again, there are many reasons not to do this. This is not a great coding practice, but this is the value I want. So let me see, const placeholder quote equal this thing. I think I probably want to break this into separate lines. And then in here, I simply want to say, give me the placeholder quote. So let's see if that fixes the type error. So it's claiming that the timestamp, it's claiming that that's not close enough, that is not close enough. It's saying that this is an observable of an array, perhaps. I'm trying to study the meaning of this here. So this is, so reading at the beginning, so it's type observable, and it's saying the observable is parameterized by the logical OR of those two things, but put in an array. Okay, so the reason, oh, I see. It's because the buffer count, it took a type, took an observable of a type and gives me back an observable of an array of that type. So I got to put this here. I need to say that this is not an observable of an fx quote anymore. It's an observable of an array of fx quotes. Okay, so now I have typed this thing, and as I look at this, I really feel like this placeholder quote probably would be best defined over here. And if I want to access it from somewhere, I have to do that. And there's this, some people would actually make this all caps, and I think I'm going to decline to do that this time because it's a little bit ugly on the eyes, but it might actually be more correct if I put placeholder quote in all caps. Okay, so let's see if this thing still runs. And there, indeed it does. Okay, so I think it's worth making another commit here. So this is going to type, in the TypeScript sense, the fx data. Okay. Okay, so what else could be done here? Is there any other sort of cleanup that can be done at the code level? Because I have in mind doing some enhancement to the data flow here, but I want to do any more code cleanup. Well, let's put this filter back in. So now that we have a way of this placeholder mechanism working, I think it's okay to filter the fx data to only one symbol, because that won't stop me from using the software. I'll be able to actually see the software run and then see the data percolate up. So let's see it. It should refresh, and now it should much more slowly have data come in, because we're only seeing data come in that happens to be of that symbol pair. And of course, I'm generating a number of different symbol pairs. Okay, so we see this working. Let's see if there's any other code improvements. Well, I don't see any more code improvements, so I think I'm going to start making a visual improvement now, and this will probably be the last thing for today. And that's what I really want to do, is I want to take this idea and I want to move it into another component, because right now I'm just doing it as my whole application, and I really want to be able to build maybe like a streaming data dashboard or something like that. And to build that, I mean, I got to start, it's fine just to start with putting data on the screen, but I need to start moving toward getting that data into components that could be composed on the screen and reused. So this was ng angular CLI generate component, and we're going to call this it's a symbol pair, so we're going to call this a pair history component. Now I tend to always follow the smart/view component pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and make a pair history view component and just kind of be ready to do a bunch of the wiring to use that pattern. So let's make that happen here. Okay, now once again, if it was real production code and I was writing non-trivial component logic, the first thing happens all the time, the second happens rarely. But if that was the case, I would be using these specs, but I'm not. I'm just going to remove these specs for now. And I know that I could type no spec when I generate the components, but I kind of like the joy of deleting code. So I get that joy each time I generate a component. Okay, so this idea right here, I basically want to move all the logic of this component into the other component. So let's go in here and just I'm just going to cut that and initially just stick that in my pair history. Now my pair history, oh, I hate that app prefix. I know that we're obligated by the style guide to do a prefix, so I'm just going to let it be there, but I really don't like that extra prefix. It's stylistically offensive to the eye. Okay, so let's say that the entire application consists of just one app pair history. And then in that pair history, I have the same template I had before, which means that I'm going to need to get the same data here in the component that I had before. So let me go to the app component and just figure out how much of this to move. But actually, from staring at it, I believe I can simply cut all of that and put all of that in here. And then I can grab the imports. And in fact, since I'm going to go ahead and move all of this. As far as I've been able to tell, it is okay and harmless to import these things more than once. So I tend to put my operator imports in each place where I use the code. That way, as I transport code around it brings the right operators with it. Okay, so I guess these things are now up a level, so I got to put another dot in. I already have a constructor, so I'll zap that. Now, here's maybe a slightly contentious point. The CLI is really helpful for getting started learning Angular because it generates this kind of on-init hook that people often use when they're getting started. But I have found that in more advanced use of Angular 2, I'm really better off without doing anything in on-init. On-init is for code that should run only once after bindings are present. But I actually hardly ever have code that needs to run only once after bindings are present. I sometimes have code that has to run only once that doesn't care about the bindings, and that code is fine to put in the constructor. And I sometimes have code that has to run each time the bindings change, including the first time, but that code goes in on changes. I actually don't do much on init, so I'm just going to take these on inits away. Okay, so this looks like a pretty good reproduction of what had been in the top level component. I think this component already got added to my module, and indeed it did, so it should be available to my view. So let's see if that was enough to work. Oh, I guess because I stopped and restarted the CLI, I have to... No, did I not restart the CLI? There we go. I didn't start the CLI. Ooh, start, not starty. Okay, so the program still works after this change. Very good. Okay, so I guess I'll try to get in one more change before wrapping up this session, and that is I made this smart view pair, and there's not much need right now. If you stare at this thing, like right here, we do this data gathering for the component, and then right here we just render it onto the screen. But the smart view idea is that you should separate the components that are doing layout from the components that are doing kind of wrappering or connecting to a data storage source, connecting to a data source. There's lots of content on the web out there about that. In fact, there's a good chance that we'll have maybe a talk or something about that eventually to post. But for the moment anyway, just sort of trust me, it's good to split things up that way. So I'm going to say, well, this is my smart component. Smart components never have any kind of non-trivial views, so smart components definitely don't need any CSS ever. Okay, the smart component should actually just wrapper the view component. So if I look at the app pair history view, that is actually all that belongs in here. And then this template goes down inside the view component instead. But this async pipe stuff I actually want to do up here. So what I really want to do is I want to say app pair history view and just say latest quotes, we'll call it latest quotes, and then it will equal this data. So in my smart component, I'm using the async pipe to send, to bind the actual data, not the observable of the data, not anything where the data came from, but just the actual data I'm going to bind down into my view component, which means my view component needs to accept an input. I guess the current style, so type these on the same line. Now this is going to be not an observable, it's just going to be an array of recent quotes, but still, I mean, we are in TypeScript, so it is responsible to go ahead and type it. So I'll put this line of code in and say that from this code's point of view, there's no observability out there. It's just an array of quotes. We don't have input. I'll stick that up there. Again, I rarely use on init. I often use changes. I often use the constructor, but I rarely use on init, so I tend to just delete them when I see them unused. So now in here we have latest quotes, which means that in the view components template, we don't, that whole async thing we don't care about. We just do kind of plain, here is the data, very, very straightforward Angular templating. By the way, we found that working with our customers, these view components are highly amenable to getting help from people just joining a project. So even someone who doesn't know a lot of Angular, someone could learn enough Angular in a few hours to do production useful work on the view components. Even if they didn't understand the whole world of Angular, if they just knew enough templating and how to bind data in, they could get really surprisingly far working on the view components of a big complex application. Okay, so let's see if this worked. I probably have some missing pieces here. It looks like I did something wrong in my smart component. So I have this latest. I've set up latest correctly. I've referred to it there. I did the async pipe. Oh, I see. I forgot to do Angular 2 data binding. That's real important. I want to bind the data, not set the attribute. Let's see if that takes care of it. Okay, there we go. So now I have used the smart view component pattern and also move my display out of my top level component. Okay, so I think we will call that enough for this session because I'm getting up on half an hour. So my usual reminder, I'm Kyle Cordes. I work at Oasis Digital. We teach Angular Bootcamp, and we would love to hire people who want to do top of the line, high quality Angular 2 work. Bye-bye.